everyone. My name is Jonathan Stoikovitch. I'm the API Evangelist at MuleSoft, and I will be moderating this panel today. I'm going to go ahead, and what we'll do is we'll start with a round of introduction. So why don't you start, Gareth?
Sure. Hey, I'm Gareth Jones. I'm an API architect at Microsoft. I've been there for a little over 20 years. I'm currently looking after all the APIs for our education platform, focusing on K-12 and higher education on the Microsoft Graph. And before that, I worked as one of the main architects on the Microsoft Graph all up. So hit me up if you've got any graph questions.
I have a lot of graph questions. Jeff?
Great. Jeff Gibson. I'm with Atlassian. I'm a data engineering manager. I'm working on our internal data platforms that allow us to expose data around the company internally.
Adrita Bhor, I'm the product management director at PayPal, managing PayPal's core checkout and payment processing APIs. I also manage the overall API strategy of what gets exposed and what doesn't.
OK, so I'm going to go ahead with my first question. I don't know exactly how much time we have, but we have a lot less than I thought, so I'm going to go right to it. So my first question is about API Development Lifecycle. So API Development Lifecycle is obviously more of a, I don't know how to put it, buzzword. I mean, it encapsulates a lot of things, and it can take a lot of shapes. So I'd like to ask individually, what shape does the API Development Lifecycle takes in your organization? Gareth, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, we've got a lot of different groups doing a lot of different things, whether they're doing code first, design first. Where we tried to pull it all together, certainly I've sort of worked more on the office half of our business. So we try and pull it together by, at a very early stage when we hear about a new API project, getting the team to come to our overall API review board and treating that not like a checkpoint gateway, but more like a coaching moment. And saying, hey, let's get you started with it. We've got published API guidelines that you can find up on GitHub. They're open sourced. Making sure that they've seen the guidelines. Obviously, a lot of people, even though they're published, a lot of our internal teams, have been off in some silo and haven't noticed them, that they're on the right track. And then offering them coaching and support as they go through the full design and build out. And then set up an appointment for later in their life cycle, however they're going about it internally as a team, to come back and again, check in and actually get signed off by our API board for the organization. And then they'll go off and do their, whether they're iterating on a very, contract first thing, or whether they're going off and doing code and letting the APIs fall off the back of that in a code first process.
Nice. How about you, Jeff?
Same question, yeah. I suppose it kind of depends whether it's an externally facing API or internally facing API. I think generally at the start, it starts with a conversation, a need from the business or from somebody in the organization. Tends to go right into producing some sort of example or specification, getting something in front of the either external or internal customers quite quickly. So we're obviously, I think everyone on this panel is part of the Open API initiative. So that generally comes in the form of a Swagger specification or an example Postman collection. If we think it's going to be contentious or there's like uneasiness about the design, we tend to spar. So we'll have small groups of people, and we'll kind of spar on design and say, do we agree with this? Do we agree with our approach, our design, what we're doing, what we're offering? From there, obviously, much can be generated from a Swagger specification. And then, obviously, if it's publicly facing, there's additional stuff like we need to get it into our developer documentation. We need to make sure the documentation is good and the language and wording is right. And then from there, it goes kind of on through the process into our developer.atlassian.com.
Yes. Can you hear me better? OK.
In our organization, I think it starts with first figuring out why do we even need an API, right? There's a lot of trying to understand the exact customer needs, external in, and trying to justify why do we even need an API. If it's something that we can reuse or build upon, then we do not create new APIs. Because we are talking all external APIs, right? We don't want to kind of have too many of them. Then, in general, our API strategy is organized around product lines. Basically, different PayPal products doing different kinds of payments, like P2P payments or doing invoicing payments. I manage all the online core checkout, which is about 80% of our revenue, right? So we do not come up with new APIs every other day. So that's basically the first step. And then after that, it's mostly about, as he said, right, ideating and working with others. And then it basically just follows the standard cycle. In large organizations, what we try to do is we also do a lot of internal as well as external training on how to use these APIs within your workflows, which is super important for us for adoption. And in the end, it is all about, how do you plug all of these things in? And then the reason we don't come up with so many APIs is it's really hard to retire APIs when it comes to the last step of APIs. So we also work a lot on, working personally with merchants and marketplaces and all of these things to how to move them over to our newer stacks.
Thank you. So before I joined MuleSoft, I remember a long time before I joined MuleSoft, there was always a debate around design first and code first, and I think most of you here heard the debate as well. So without entering into this debate, because I don't think there's a, I think the reason why there's still a debate today is because there's still, a good balance on pros and cons. So without entering the debate, can you tell us what approach your team has taken and why it works?
Sure. So like I said, we have teams spread around the business doing both. Teams are actually quite passionate about both. And what we try and do is actually, and I'm going to sort of dodge your question a little bit, is focus on taking all of them and saying, and I'm kind of echoing what you were saying, pull them all back out of that to being scenario first, and then saying we don't really care then about which of those two processes, but if you can't actually be crisp about what external customer need this is serving, then we want to put the brakes on you and say, well, go back and rethink why you're doing this at all, because so many teams come to us with, hey, we've got the internals, our world, we'd like to expose our internals to the outside world. And we're sort of like, okay, to do what? And, unless they can come and say, and this is what people are going to do with us, and we've got these 5 customers lined up who are saying, yes, I really want to be able to do X, Y, and Z scenario with your API, then the rest doesn't really matter, to be honest. They really shouldn't be launching anything. So
does it usually start with some sort of a specification?
Yeah, I mean, we have a real variety of people engaged in the design process, from very technical people who might show up with a beautifully crafted Swagger document or a CSDL, because we do a lot of OData, to people who this is their first API and they're used to doing, program managing UI design, who show up with a beautiful PowerPoint about what the products built on top of the API will be able to do, right, and assume that some engineer is going to translate that magically into a spec, and they really don't care. But to them, an API is the end result of what it can do, and so working across that spectrum is kind of interesting.
Nice. Sounds familiar. Do you want to answer the question?
Sure, absolutely. I think, kind of to your point, I think it really does depend on the team or the individual what they want to go with. But one thing that I'll note, I think, is that with the tooling that's kind of come up around things like Swagger and Ramble, et cetera, it's kind of inconvenient to do code first, right? If you think about what you want to produce out of it, I want to produce good documentation, I want to produce examples, I want schema validation, I want these things. It's it's almost easier to just start with the API design first. It'll make your coding much easier. Also, I think producing an example for a customer or somebody internally and producing something for sparring or design sessions, I think API design first is pretty prevalent in our company.
Yeah, same in PayPal as well. I think I strongly believe that large organizations who have a lot of data and simply think, oh, I have to develop a platform, so let me just start putting API jackets on my data and kind of exposing outside, take a very inside-out view and So we try to stay away from that kind of an approach and actually look the other way, external in, and we swaggerize first. And then there are a lot of integration folks within PayPal itself, like professional services, sales engineers, product marketing managers. There are just tons of them within PayPal itself. So what we first do is we have these mock services, as he was mentioning, running on certain servers, and we start collecting feedback internally. We also believe in doing a lot of dogfooding as our APIs are getting built. And in general, I have seen that going with a design-first approach lets you, if you want to fail, you'll fail fast, and then you'll recover quickly, right? Rather than the other way around. And so I think I strongly believe that having that fail-fast attitude with just a design and a good documentation is a better approach, because what it does is it future-proofs your API, because you've done the research on the use cases first, rather than the data side of it.
Thank you. So to my next questions. So API specs and APIs are the high level, right, the top layer, whereas they usually transport the meat of everything, which is the data layer, and that's usually defined using schemas, right? So, and there's been schemas before there's been API specs. So schemas or XSD schemas, protobuf, OData, so the schematron, there's tons of them, and RAML types as well. So my question is, how do you enforce that your data across not only wherever this data transits through, but throughout your API lifecycle, so whenever it's like API management or testing, design, how do you make sure that that data conforms to those schemas?
Honestly, it's one of our biggest problems is in turn trying to pull together large numbers of teams who are often relatively siloed from the work each other are doing, to get them to buy into shared schema and the dependency that brings. Teams are pretty unkeen on taking dependencies on other teams at the best of times. And so having suddenly saying, hey, particularly if it's somebody external coming in, like the API board, saying, hey, you've decided that there's an address in your API. Well, you need to take a dependency on our centralized notion of address. Well, then what if the powers that be decide
address
to...
being like a schema that represents an address.
Yeah, like a postal address, something like that, just as an example. Well, what if somebody goes and adds maybe this is not a great example because nobody much adds an extra field to a postal address, right? But something that gets an extra field added to it. Now, are they on the hook to say, we'll go immediately take the new additive version of that? Are we going to expect to suddenly get a bunch of data in that our customers are expecting? Now, obviously, their APIs are going to work because they'll just fail cleanly with extra data. But that doesn't mean they'll have happy customers, because their customers say, well, the Microsoft definition of a postal address says it supports these 7 fields, but your API only actually does anything with 6 of them. It succeeds, but it's not customer satisfaction. So it's been really interesting trying to connect those up and deal with the trade-offs between obviously the power of sharing and the dependencies that brings. And I guess where we've landed is saying, let's try and absolutely minimize the shared surface down to the things which are really core. There's a real tendency to try and share everything and to overshare when you get into this. And we've actually found out that people's businesses take them in different directions on things. So we'll be really hardcore about saying, hey, if you come and propose that there's something with 10 elements in it that you want to share, how sure really are you that everybody who's ever going to want to use this data structure needs all 10? And we'll end up saying, well, okay, 4 of them go into the central shared repository of schema, and the other 6 we'll just let your business manage those, because who knows what the next 5 businesses that come along might want to do with it.
Good question. I think I mean, we have a lot of microservices across our platform. I think probably in the thousands. Given that we've kind of standardized on using Open API or Swagger specification, I think one thing that we do really well is I think every service kind of is expected to have some definition. If I go to a platform service and I see that there's no Swagger spec or there's no Swagger UI or anything like that, I think there's probably something uneasy about this application. Is this the right API for me? Setting discovery of services aside, I think just having some sort of standard schema or way you define things, which I think at Atlassian is primarily through JSON schemas. Just having that available kind of and well thought out is the first step. I think one thing that at least within my org that I'm starting to do is to refer to schemas as contracts. Really to set that tone with people that, hey, this is a contract. Do you agree to this contract? There's two parties involved in this contract. Will you fulfill this contract? So just starting to use that language and really to focus change management around those schemas, I think sets a really good tone. And then making sure that there are schemas for everything helps initially. I think what you're talking about is defining entities or objects or things across an organization. I think that's probably still a challenge within our company. We're starting to do some on the business side. And one way we tackle it on the engineering and the platform side is also to create shared services. So rather than have people build competing but similar things, we're actually saying this is the one service that will fulfill your nuance or your need of what you try to do. So I think kind of in that combination with standardization and then also making sure that only one team is really building a certain feature and that's the go-to and it's well defined and well documented. So there's a lot of focus, can really drive a lot of efficiency.
A few things to comment over here. We have an API governance team within PayPal. So the discovery part is maintained by our intranet. It's called PPaaS, PayPal as a Service. And we have very strict guidelines on how we can publish even all our internal APIs. So the directory is pretty easy to use. Certain other things we do is, again, we do common object definitions and definitions that go across all different kinds of schema types and things like that. So internally figuring out what those basic building blocks are and then developing them. And then you can expose them in any which way you want. And reused all over it. And then we also abstract these things out. What we do for internal APIs is we kind of give our internal groups kind of a directive that first they also need to version. Just because it's an internal API doesn't mean that you can keep changing on it because there are many people who are dependent on it within the company itself, right? It's not as stringent as I would say external APIs, but it's still pretty good. And then we ask them to abstract out the complications between these versions. So we kind of ask them to maintain it so that we can, it's not absolutely mandatory for the developers to move right away so they can have a path to where they need to go. So these are some of the things we do across all the different schema types and things.
Nice. So you just said I have a follow-up question. So you just said you had an API governance team, right? Mm-hmm. Where do you involve them in the process? Do you involve them everywhere, or it's just at the moment you want to expose that API?
Many different places. Primarily, they give us support with API design, things you can do, things you cannot. Sometimes I actually look forward to their support because saying no is really hard from a product management side. So I kind of ask API governance to come join the support team and help voice the right thing to do.
Or have someone else be the police.
Yeah, that's what product managers do, right?
So my next question is around these new kinds of APIs. So I think we talked a little bit earlier about GraphQL and Postman. I think just announced GraphQL support, so that's great. So there's other types of new APIs out there that people want to define and manage in their API development lifecycle. And that includes also async APIs, all those message queue systems and so on. So what I'd like to know is how do you handle this new kind of APIs in a mostly REST-ish world, and how does that work for you?
Yeah, it's a real oncoming challenge for us at the moment. We've built up a muscle around how to design REST APIs, how to do governance around REST APIs, how to use our equivalent of an API council to to go and inject some strictness in how people do their design and release around them. And we just don't have that around, particularly streaming APIs and those kind of things. And so we're sort of, showing up with people having read our REST API design guidelines and trying to apply bits of them to their streaming APIs here and there, and not knowing which bits they should apply and where, and saying, can we get an exception on this guideline? And then we find ourselves saying, well, I think you can get an exception on all of them. You're not building a REST API. You should tell us what help us write the next guideline for the next kind of APIs. I think we were sort of in a bit of a complacent state where we'd kind of thought, oh, we built an API guideline. Hey, we even published it. That's awesome. Didn't we do well? Pat, pat, pat. Rather than realizing we need to be in an ongoing place of saying, well, this is a super fast evolving place. We need to keep evolving our guidance, building more sets of guidance for more kinds of APIs.
Jeff?
Absolutely. So this is really interesting, actually. Like, this is really where more of my domain comes in, is where the platform that I manage is really more asynchronous, event-based, eventually consistent. So for us, like, shifting to thinking about streaming, shifting to think about events has actually been, it's really interesting. Like, we're pushing a lot of change, and we're working with a lot of teams, especially internal, like back office IT, that haven't really thought about their data in this way and the value that data can be when you're streaming it or you're eventing it at an exact moment where you're publishing rather than letting people request data from you. And so I think, like, we have a lot of strengths here, where we have we have a lot of shared platform services, and so we have one specific one where we manage all of our schemas and have them validated against before any data can be put into the pipe. And so this is where it comes in, where we manage these contracts and then the versions of these contracts there centrally, so bad data that doesn't agree with the schema kind of can't get in. That's not to say that people can't write bad schemas where you just accept an object and call it a day. But generally, we've seen a lot of strengths there, but it is like a cultural change. And I think then on to things like GraphQL. My platform has had a GraphQL at scale in production for over a year now. It's really different for people, and I'm very excited that Postman now supports GraphQL because it's just a shift to the way people would interact with our services. It's interesting too, we talk about versioning, and with GraphQL, they're actually like, can we come up with a paradigm where we don't want to version? I actually don't version our API at all. And so I think the key to that comes back to what I mentioned, is where we have to really focus on the contract, where somebody has to take ownership, that if they want to change this contract or break this contract, like, that's a big deal. Like, why are you doing this? Was our original specification not good enough? Did you disagree with it? Were you not involved? And so we push the collaboration up to those schemas. And we focus really about, like, agreeing on the contracts and the way we want to see data. And then also, to your point about, like, entity governance or common objects, also trying to encourage people to use the same type of object. Like, what is a contact at Atlassian? What is an invoice at Atlassian? What is an order at Atlassian?
I have a follow-up question for you.
Sure.
So you said you don't version your APIs. So I'm guessing you'll tell me if I'm right, but this means that you expect your clients, as in HTTP clients and users of HTTP clients, to read your spec. So how do you spec out those GraphQL and asynchronous APIs?
Yeah, so I mean, for the most part, it's really schemas, right? So to understand the schema and the data, you can come back, and then GraphQL has some tools around introspection and other things where you can figure out what the schema is. So we don't really hide anything. Pretty much, you get an understanding of what all the fields and what everything that's available, and then you can get tricky with, like, deprecating fields, and, like, instead of, like, having one field that's only named something, you kind of have to think about, if you do want to make a breaking change, how do you want to create a new field? How do you want to do these things? But the benefit is that it forces teams to be a bit more collaborative. I think as far as ownership on making a breaking change, it's a lot less on me to maintain 20, 30 versions of an API than to have teams come to consensus around, like, what's a good solution, and understand the importance of ensuring that this design is actually going to be good enough so that someone won't come back a month from now and say, I changed my mind, like, I want to use camel case, like, I don't like the underscore in this name. Can we just do this because I feel like it?
That's where the API governance team comes in.
Yeah. I mean, we try really hard to not version, let's put it this way, right? It is a super hard task, but the eventuality is that changes come in, use cases come in. From what PayPal is trying to do, we are trying to create this single integration platform. We take like the simplest of the use cases for a single small merchant trying to do an online transaction with 5 lines of code, all the way up to complex marketplaces use cases, all on the same API. So the challenge is, how do you design something which addresses 5 lines of code all the way up to maybe like hundreds of lines of code, right? So a lot of that onus falls there. And as far as you asked asynchronous APIs, right? We use asynchronous APIs, and keep in mind for us, our data is very atomic because it's all transactional data, right? So eventual consistency doesn't really work that well for us. And so from our perspective, asynchronicity is actually built in our checkout API to handle tons of load when we are talking thousands of transactions per second right before holiday time or something like that. So the difference is when you build asynchronous APIs, the same API which works as asynchronous as well as in asynchronous mode, we actually change the way you integrate with that API. So you're mostly dependent, for asynchronous methods, you're getting a 202, which says request accepted. And that's, is it slowly processing through your transactions, which there may be many, it keeps sending you webhooks, which is a little more difficult integration, but given that the load would usually come from very large enterprises, they have the bandwidth to accommodate more complex integrations. Compared to the same API being used by a small merchant where you just have 5 lines of code and all you want to see is a transaction complete immediately, they just use the same API in a synchronous mode. So that I find really interesting because we've built these technologies within PayPal to maintain these kinds of varied elastic loads, as I want to call it.
So you were saying that at PayPal you don't you discourage versioning? Is that what you're saying?
We discourage it, but we cannot get away from it.
Right.
Is what we're saying.
So how do you manage it?
It's hard because what we have seen is APIs, when built well, have very high retention. And that's what you're struggling against as a product manager because I have 9 million integrations on Express Checkout APIs, which I manage, and they were built 15 years ago, right? People who are on version 3 of it and pumping millions of dollars, well, it works for them. How do I bring them over to the new set? So it poses a completely different set of challenges, and that's the main reason why if I had not been able to deprecate my first API, not deprecate, sunset my first API, there is no point in keeping on creating newer and newer versions of the REST APIs and GraphQL APIs and all of these things because, I don't think I'll see adoption on them, because it's very hard to put that carrot for these people to move over when things are working fine for them.
Right. So do you have any sort of either process or migration tool that you offer?
We have many processes. We have entire organizations within our company who are dedicated to working with these channel partners, people who bring that business to us and working to upgrade their integrations to today's standards. And we have also taken some theories on, let's build all the new stuff that's coming for managing our product lines in the new stack. So at least that way, when you give newer capabilities and functionalities, right, on the newer stack, maybe, you'll be able to convince a merchant to move over, but it still is a difficult journey. So that's why we don't like versioning, but, it is kind of a necessary evil, is what I'd like to call it.
You build the incentive around.
Yeah, we work we work to build the value props around how we can actually market our new set of APIs. Yeah, we do that.
Gareth, how do you manage API versioning?
Well, the Microsoft Graph's been live for I think about 2 years now, and we haven't versioned yet. And we're still in a raging internal debate about when we should do our first version. And we're getting to the point now where there's we're starting to see the pain of not versioning. So there's some decisions we made back at the start with the first APIs that got, so the Microsoft Graph, I don't know how familiar with it, it's essentially a common API surface for a lot of Microsoft APIs, joining them together and providing a graph linking them together. But then that underneath, it's essentially an API proxy sending it down to the individual backends for a whole bunch of different things. So, something like SharePoint, OneDrive, Outlook, those kind of things. So the early services that adopted the Microsoft Graph and came on board made some decisions in their API that now, we regret and we would kind of like to version. But it's not just about saying to them and their customers, hey, well, we've got a new version and we'd like to start moving you forward onto it. It's the fact that because of that shared type, a lot of those early things went into our first version of the common data model. So we've got a version of that now as well. And of course, they've been adopted. So those things that we would like to change are now spread like a virus across many of our other services. So we'd now be saying, okay, well, if we want to version the graph, not only do we want to upgrade these things that were your decision in this backend service 2 years ago or 3 years ago when they were actually doing the design, but you and you also need to go change, and we need to coordinate that across all of you because we want you snapping to the version at the same time for that common thing from an availability point of view, and that's proving tough.
Right. Well, thank you. Should we go straight to questions? We had more questions, but I guess, yes.
Hello. So for this question isn't as relevant for public APIs, but for vendor and I guess private APIs, I was wondering if you guys have experimented with accepting schemas or contracts from clients of your APIs and using those to test and to manage version changes. And I guess what your thoughts on that approach might be.
So the question is, have you accepted schemas?
Yes. So I think in the process that you're describing, the creation of a schema is kind of a collaborative project. And I think that works really well for organizations that are on board the API train. But like if somebody in an organization has to start the movement towards APIs and restructuring products internally to work towards that, sometimes managing changes later on can be difficult. So I'm curious, do you ever accept like specific definitions from clients of your APIs in how they use your APIs so you know what is viable for change and what will be more difficult moving forward?
We've certainly got, I can think of an example for, it's not strictly an internal API, but it's one of our public APIs that gets very driven, so that's the Outlook API. So the Outlook API has been a public API for years and years, but a lot of its change, which obviously because we haven't versioned has been additive change, is very much driven by the Outlook, the main Outlook client, the app on your phone that you use if you're using Outlook. And that team is really opinionated and absolutely sends in, hey, we think you should change the schema to look like this because this would be a lot easier for us. And they're right, it would, and they are by far the biggest client, doing hundreds of millions of requests. But often we take a look at it and we say, yeah, that would be excellent for your use case, but it would be really awful and confusing for the rest of the public API space, particularly from a conceptual baggage space. Often they want things expressed in terms of things that are very internal centric, not in terms of customer friendly concepts. So I think the important thing is to translate what that external team is saying into a need, not just to take the schema that they say they want, but then translate it into something that more people can use, because otherwise you're in danger of producing an API that's only good for that first client.
I would say, think 4 or 5 steps ahead, and then figure out what that requirement actually translates into. And I agree with you, rather than actually looking at the specification, try to answer the requirement there, and that will actually help you build an API that's more future-proof.
We have time for one more question?
Yeah, I had a question here.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm from QA, so I'm one of the most passionate users of your APIs. My question to you is, how do you communicate to your external customers the order in which the API calls should be executed in order to have a success or happy path? And would you consider having development teams publish like Postman collections to show how to use your API, not just the Swagger endpoints.
Correct, right. Yeah, we do that. That's exactly what we do.
Awesome. How about everybody? Do you
gonna say
all
Postman
require-
collection.
Yeah,
Yeah.
do you guys require your development teams to publish
Yeah.
the order in which, because we're struggling with our teams to do that.
We do two things. We are working towards completely overhauling our developer documentation, so stay tuned. We are running a huge experiment, collecting feedback, by the way, so or from external developers on how best to show this and showcase. So our developer documentation is moving towards visualizing these flows. So so if you want somebody to use your API in a certain way, in a certain flow, then it's best to to actually visually show how that works. So that's one step that we are taking. And the second step is, as you mentioned, on Postman and showing and showcasing use cases and workflows using Postman APIs.
Great, thank you. We want to go past Swagger. Keep going.
Can we take one more question? Yeah, over there.
Hey guys, working across multiple teams, having dependencies that between your provider and your consumer, I'd like to hear how some of the teams that you guys work for have addressed contract testing. It seems to be this sort of elusive set of problems that just seem to exist in production. I know Atlassian's tried, we've tried heavily to try to address that issue. I'd like to hear really from all of you guys to see if you guys have tried to tackle that problem in other ways with other tools.
Can you ask the question again? Sorry.
The question's around contract testing
Yeah.
and how do you prevent your consumer-provider relationship from breaking in production?
Okay, so how to respect the contract and how to enforce the contract, basically.
Right.
Which we talked about it a little bit,
Yeah.
but I guess your question is around tooling. Is that what you're
Around
saying?
tooling that's used, or possibly, utilizing Postman in some format.
Yep.
Some other format that's used by other teams that I've never heard of.
I mean, I know at MuleSoft we use we have our own set of tooling to enforce.
Yeah, we have custom tools to do that, like validators and stuff, to make sure that we adhere to that. Haven't really used anything out from the industry to do that, but it's mostly held by API internal tools, mostly around validation and making sure that everything sticks around.
In my experience, sorry if I'm answering for you, but in my experience, there's a lot of tools out there, and sometimes on paper they even look great, and you're all excited when you discover them, and then when it comes to time that you're using it, you realize that there are limitations, not necessarily due to the tool, but due to the fact that your domain or your particular use case, doesn't exactly fit in that tool. So you'll have to either
or the
use
maintenance cost is just higher across both teams,
Yeah.
both for the consumer and the provider.
Yeah. Well, sometimes you can extend things like JSON schema validator to your own need, or add something on top of it, so that you don't have to maintain that part. But
Yeah, we built some tools internally that check whether, and it is as part of the publishing flow for an API, check whether a change is a breaking change, and just throw red flags left, right, and center if somebody's trying to push a breaking change, to make sure that there's some fairly high-level human sign-off, so they can't just creep through unexpected.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're talking about like producer consumer, like you're probably talking about publishing data and subscribing to data. Like one thing my team does is we work with a lot of different teams to kind of collect data from many different places. One thing we do is we try to make it pretty transparent, that we understand somebody's use case. So like if somebody will produce some data and they expect us to store it or expose it in a certain way, we actually make that collaborative, and we say, okay, here's your use case. Take a look at this. Here's the 5 different ways you'll send us data. Here's what you can expect on the other end. Here's what you can expect us to consistently provide. And then when things go through our deployment pipeline, if we get to a place where a change breaks that contract, we then reach out to the team and say, hey, did we actually break your contract? Or was your contract just defined in a strange way? I think also like, there's really no, like, you can never spend too much time defining a contract. Like things should be very, very, very ironclad. Like enumerations are your friend. Like go nuts on types. Like JSON schema allows you to do some stuff that are even outside of what JavaScript kind of offers. It's like if you really want something to be an int, just say it's an int. So that's my approach.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Drita. Thank you, everyone. It was nice.